My name is Mimi Healy. I work for the Costs of War Project. I'm a research assistant there, and I do a lot of like website assistance and copy editing and all kinds of various things. So the Costs of War Project, I don't know if any of you have heard of it before, but it is housed at Brown University at the Watson Institute, which is their school for international and public affairs. And the Cost of War Project is essentially a research project that works with scholars from all over the world to publish papers examining the various costs and ripple effects of the post 9/11 wars. So that was called like the Global War on Terror. That was coined by George Bush, after 9/11. And so the co-founders of Costs of War, one of them is an anthropologist named Catherine Letts, and the other one is a political scientist named Nita Crawford. They were both professors at Brown, and in 2011, they really noticed that, 10 years after 9/11 and 10 years of being at war, um, through this war on terror, they noticed that, a lot of the approach to fighting that war and to spending money on that war and people's perceptions of just constantly being at war for the past 10 years was s- you know, really lacking. Like people either weren't talking very much about it or it felt like something that was just kind of happening in the background. So they developed the Cost of War project to really acknowledge all of the, horrible ways that war impacts people's lives. So that's looking at the economic costs. So like how much does the government spend? How much does it impact us through, taxes or through taking away money that could be spent otherwise? So the economic cost, we look at the human and social costs. So how does this impact people's lives? Everything from, you know, death and the loss of human life to um, if someone loses their house and their job through a bomb, and they're, a woman whose husband died and she doesn't have another option for work. What does she do with her life, or things like that. And then we look at the political cost. So how did the post 9/11 wars and our response to it as a country in the US and other responses, how has that changed politics? How has our political establishment really been molded through 20 plus years of war now? And and environmental cost. Nita Crawford, the political scientist that I mentioned, a lot of her work is around the environmental costs of war. So she actually recently wrote a book that looks at climate change in relation to the US military and war, because the US Department of Defense is actually the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, like the largest single institution emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. But, of course, like the government isn't usually talking about that, right? When we're talking about all the green initiatives that are happening, and it's always outside of like reining in our military and all the jet fuel that happen that just pollutes the earth, and also looking at environmental impacts such as um in Iraq and Afghanistan, places that have been heavily bombed, had these burn pits in the ground, um, have been contaminated in so many different ways. How does the environmental impact of war contribute to birth defects or unclean water, and what effect does that have? So the project really looks at like all of these various things, and the goal is really just to change, or not change as much as like encourage the narrative around these wars to really critically hold our government accountable, and to kind of through like an activist goal to really ask like, was this worth it? What came of these wars? How can we learn from this? And we're so fortunate to live in a country where we can hold our government accountable, and where we can question um, the the military and the government. There's so many countries where you'd be thrown in jail, or targeted heavily. So we really want to take advantage of that, and as citizens of this country to and and as like just people with wanting a more peaceful and just world, how can we question everything that's happened since post 9/11? And I mean, since 9/11, how can we question the larger umbrella of everything that's happened and how that's affected us as a country? So yeah, I mean, as a younger person, I guess now, something that really impacted me when learning about the work that Cost of War does is just how much of this has of being at war for over 20 years, in this war on terror since 2001, how much of that has really impacted like our lives and inequality in this country and elsewhere. So, I can like give you guys a bunch of statistics that we found. But I guess I just wanted to say that first off, because when you've been at war, or when you've lived in a country that's been at war for most of your life, or all of your life, probably in all of your cases, um, it becomes sort of background noise, and we don't take into account maybe the everyday reality that's happening on the ground in countries that we've invaded, or have provided, training and assistance to, and what exactly that really means. So that's something just personally, like when I learned about the project, I really became interested in that. I think of war as like this umbrella, and a lot of other um, ways that we see inequality, or, big issues like climate change, a lot of social justice issues. Um, those all can kind of fall under the umbrella of war, in terms of like what lens you look at it through. So I guess with that being said, not only like questioning the narrative of war, right? Like how have you been taught about war? And as students, like what has your perspective on war been? Um, because I think it's kind of, like I said, easy to detach from that. But something that I really appreciate about the project is that it really grounds that in like our lived experience, and in learning the lived experience of people who have been impacted by these wars. So, I'll just kind of give you some statistics like off the bat. And one thing with statistics, right, is like we hear numbers all the time, especially with the internet. Like you're consuming data or visualizations or infographics all day long. And it's hard to make sense of these numbers. So that's something that, we're always kind of wanting to think about, like, how can we not just gloss over this and really take into account the destruction that's happened, and use that to hopefully create change. So, our research has found that that the post 9/11 wars have caused almost 1 million direct deaths. So that's death that has been caused by direct combat, by bombs, by airstrikes, by like direct targeted operations in war. But we had a paper come out last year that recently found that for every one direct death, there's about 3 to 4 times as many indirect deaths. And so an indirect death is the deaths that are caused by like ongoing ramifications of war. So if, hospitals have been targeted and there's no healthcare or infrastructure, houses are lost, or, the water is contaminated and there's disease or there's lack of sanitation, all of these things can continue for years and years and years and generations. Um, so, we came out with a number last year that given the direct and indirect deaths of post 9/11 wars, this could be at least 4.5 to 4.7 million people have died from these wars. And um, the war zones that we include in our research are Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. Let me make sure I'm not forgetting one. Um, yeah, I think those are Pakistan. Yeah, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya are like the main ones that have been the main countries that have felt probably some of the largest impacts. But now, I don't know if you all have like seen in the news or read about it in class or anything, but the US is really engaged with Africa. So, we would count like Somalia in a lot of those counts, in a lot of our research, because the US has conducted so many airstrikes targeting a terrorist group called Al-Shabaab um, in that country. So that's another, I guess that leads me to another thing. Like that is something that's really interesting about the war on terror, is that, the Twin Towers in New York were attacked by members of Al Qaeda, and around 3,000 people died in the US. And so, uh, we invaded Afghanistan. Later in 2003, we invaded Iraq, and then have since conducted what is called a counter-terror, so like trying to fight terrorism. This idea of terrorism that really like sprung up more in 2001, it really became like so prominent. So we had a paper come out last year that found that we engage in counterterrorism operations in 78 countries. I guess one thing also that is really interesting economically is that our research has found that these wars have cost over $8 trillion.